Justice was finally being served after 2 years of fighting my mother-in-law's attempts to take control. My name is Sarah Chin, and until 3 years ago, I believed that I had a good relationship with my mother-in-law, Patricia Thompson. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its official seal glinting in the afternoon sun, and my hands trembled as I opened it. It was the final paperwork confirming my inheritance from Grandma Rose, altered when my cherished grandmother died and left me her $4 million legacy. Patricia stated during the reading of the will, her immaculately manicured nails tapping against the conference room table, "I just don't understand why she'd leave everything to you. After all, you're not even blood kin," and I could still hear the contempt in her voice as she highlighted "not family" as if it were a dirty thing. But Grandma Rose had loved me since her grandfather, Michael, brought me home, treating me like the granddaughter she had not had for 8 years. Patricia spent her time at country clubs and charity galas, and I visited Rose every Sunday. We shared stories about our lives, cooked together, and gardened together until she began to show signs of. I was the one who arranged her care and helped her manage her medical appointments. Someone needs to manage her finances. About 6 months prior to Rose's death, Patricia had stated at a family dinner that she was obviously not in her right mind anymore, causing all these changes to her way of life. I should have seen the warning signs when Patricia began unexpectedly hovering over Rose's house, her shoulder as she went over her financial records, but I was too preoccupied with taking care of Rose to notice the manipulation taking place right in front of me. I didn't realize how far Patricia would go to obtain Rose's money until after the funeral. I petitioned to be named executor of the estate, which she announced one morning as she entered my kitchen as if she owned it, giving her limited. I sat down with my coffee cup and tried to maintain my composure as I read the will. Patricia Rose specifically named me as an executive and asked me to manage her estate. She smiled that patronizing smile that I detest, saying, "You're a kindergarten teacher. What do you know about managing millions?" In addition, we both know that Rose wasn't in her right mind when she made those changes. But what? Patricia was unaware that I had been planning for this moment for years. Ever since I became aware of her growing interest in Rose's finances, I had begun recording every conversation, every unexpected visit, and every effort to keep Rose apart from other family members. I even had videos of Rose clearly expressing her desires during her lucid moments, which I had recorded with her full knowledge and consent. Contained records of Patricia herself conspiring with her attorney to have Rose declared incompetent. "We simply need to have her evaluated by the appropriate physician," she stated in one recording, unaware that my phone was recording everything she said. I also had documentation from her doctors attesting to her mental competency when she updated her will, and most damaging of all, I had recordings of Patricia herself. We have serious concerns about Mrs. Thompson's mental state, and we can contest everything she has done in the last year, including that absurd will. Patricia first realized that things weren't going her way during the initial court hearing when her lawyer, a slick man named James Barrett, stood before the judge with his customary confidence. "Was experiencing documented cognitive decline. Your Honor, my attorney Susan Martinez intervened. We have a wealth of medical records that demonstrate Mrs. Thompson's competence when she updated her will, including assessments from 3 different neurologists." Barrett faltered a little but persisted, "And we think it's best for the estate to have someone with more financial expertise overseeing. I don't care what it takes, that money belongs in this case. These assets belong to Mrs. Chen, a schoolteacher with no experience, Your Honor." Susan interrupted again, asking if we could show the exhibit. She then played one of my recordings of Patricia and Barrett talking about their plan to take over the estate. Patricia's face went pale as her voice filled the courtroom. When the recording concluded, the judge turned to Patricia's attorney, Mr. Barrett. "Are you aware that plotting to fraudulently seize control of an estate is a serious offense?" Barrett tugged at his collar, suddenly looking less confident. "Your Honor, I can explain," but there was no way to explain away the judge's darkened expression as he listened. Susan methodically presented our case over the course of the following 2 hours, presenting the medical records, Rose's videos, and numerous recordings of Patricia's attempts to manipulate the situation. By the time we were done, Patricia's petition had not only been denied, but she was also facing possible legal repercussions for her actions. The court found unmistakable evidence of attempted fraud, and the judge declared that Mrs. Shan would continue to serve as executive in accordance with the wishes of the deceased, and Mrs. Patricia Thompson is hereby barred from any contact with the estate. Mr. Barrett, I advise you to discuss your involvement in this matter with the Ethics Board. That day, as we were leaving the courthouse, Patria grabbed my arm. Her composed exterior had broken, exposing the anger underneath you. "You think you won," she hissed, "but this isn't over. That money belongs in this family." I calmly. Michael's voice interrupted her tirade. My husband had been quietly supportive throughout this ordeal, torn between loyalty to his mother and his knowledge of what was right. "Sarah is my wife." "You're right, Patricia," she said, taking her hand off my arm. "The money does belong in the family. That's exactly where Rose placed it with me." "You're not family," she spat. "You're just some gold digger who wormed her way in, Mom." Taking my hand, she was more like family to Grandma Rose than you ever were during the years you were too busy for Sunday visits. Sarah was there when Rose needed assistance, and you were the only one attempting to take advantage of this situation. Patria flinched as though she had been slapped. Then she turned on her heel and bounded off her pricey. That evening, as Michael and I sat in our kitchen talking about the day's events, I noticed that my phone was buzzing with text messages from Patricia's friends, prominent society women she had recruited in her campaign against me. One message read, "You've made a powerful enemy." The Thompson family has a long memory, so I showed Michael the messages, but he simply shook his head, saying they couldn't harm you. As I sat there reading through the increasingly hostile messages, I realized something important. Losing control of Rose's estate wasn't just a financial blow, it was a social embarrassment she wouldn't easily forget. He said, "We have the truth on our side," but we both knew that this wasn't really about truth or justice for Patricia. Instead, it was about control and maintaining her image as the matriarch of a wealthy family. I picked up my phone and started forwarding the threatening messages to Susan, saying that if Patria wanted to continue this fight, I would be ready because I had learned from our first battle documentation that everything was important. The following morning, I went to work as usual, teaching my kindergarten. It was no longer just about protecting my inheritance, it was about confronting a woman who had spent years controlling and intimidating others to get her way. During my lunch break, I received an urgent call from Susan Patricia, who had filed an appeal. She claimed to have new evidence regarding Rose's mental state, but that wasn't the worst part. I had to brace myself because she had also filed a complaint with your school board, accusing you of professional misconduct and trying to get you fired, Sarah. She's accusing you of using your job as a teacher to manipulate Rose by taking her to school functions and using the kids to emotionally coerce her into altering her will. The accusation was so baseless that it would have been amusing if it weren't so potentially detrimental to my career. Yes, I had taken Rose to some school functions, and she enjoyed watching the kids perform. As I hung up the phone, I noticed my reflection in the classroom window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had once worked so hard to gain Patricia's approval. She had been replaced by someone stronger who wouldn't. Holiday shows, but the idea that I had somehow used this to manipulate her was absurd. We need to meet Susan tonight, if at all possible, because this is getting ugly, and we need to be ready. Patricia's attempt to have me fired backfired spectacularly. The school board called an emergency meeting to review her allegations, but I came prepared because Mrs. Thompson's claims are not only untrue, but I had a few more cards to play that would make her previous humiliation in court seem like a minor embarrassment. Patricia wanted to play hardball, which was fine. Our ace in the hole was a video recording from the previous year's Christmas pageant, in which Rose was seen sitting in the audience with other grandparents. Susan said that they were malicious and presented the board with a thick folder of evidence. We'd have signed statements from several witnesses, including parents and school staff, attesting that Mrs. Rose Thompson's visits to the school were always appropriate and supervised. More importantly, the video shows Patria herself standing at the back of the auditorium, clearly aware of and unconcerned by her mother-in-law's presence at school events. If Mrs. Chen was using these events to manipulate Mrs. Rose Thompson, why did he raise concerns at the time? Patricia fumbled for an answer, her typical poise cracking. Her face was beaming as she watched the children perform. The board unanimously dismissed Patricia's complaint, but the harm to her reputation was only getting started. The local newspaper learned of the story, and all of a sudden the Thompson family's dirty laundry was revealed. At the time, I was unaware of what Susan had pressed, that your mother-in-law liked spending time with her grandson's wife and her students, or that you could use these innocent visits as ammunition in your vendetta. Read the headline, which described Patricia's attempts to take over the estate, her false accusations against me, and her history of manipulative behavior. The social fallout was immediate, as Patricia's country club friends, The same ones who had been threatening me stopped communicating with me and changed their stance on a number of issues. As other members of the charity boards started to distance themselves, Patricia continued to fight for her appeal of the initial court decision. Her lawyer claimed to have new evidence regarding Rose's mental state, which turned out to be testimony from Rose's former housekeeper, Maria, who stated that she had seen Rose in states of confusion where she was unable to remember or recognize family members. Patricia was unaware of the following basic facts. I had kept in touch with Maria following Rose's death. On the morning of the appeal hearing, Maria arrived in court with us rather than Patricia. Mrs. Ramirez Susan started asking, "Can you tell us about your recent conversation with Mrs. Patricia Thompson?" Maria straightened in her seat, offered me money to lie, and stated firmly that she wanted me to say Mrs. Rose was. The judge's face darkened as Maria described Patricia's attempts to bribe her. After she finished testifying, he turned to Patricia's lawyer, Mr. Barrett. "Are you aware that suborning perjury is a criminal offense?" Barrett, looking more and more uncomfortable, asked for a brief recess when the court heard her testimony. Recommenced 20 minutes later. He declared that his client was withdrawing her appeal, but the judge wasn't done yet. "Mrs. Thompson," he said in a tone that was stern, "this court takes a very dim view of attempting to corrupt the judicial process. You are hereby fined $50,000 for contempt of court, and I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges." Patricia sat rigidly in shock. When we left the courthouse for the second time, Patricia was surrounded by reporters, and the society pages that had previously featured her charitable work now featured pictures of her attempting to hide her face. The judge went on to say that you were also ordered to pay all legal fees that Mrs. Chen had incurred in defending against this baseless appeal. Should you attempt any further legal action regarding this estate, you will face additional sanctions. Michael's sister, Catherine, Patricia's daughter, who had stayed neutral throughout the conflict, had a complete meltdown and reported locking herself in her room and refusing to speak to anyone. From cameras that evening, as Michael and I sat in our backyard talking about the day's events, his phone rang. Her father was considering taking her to a therapist, so Michael sighed deeply. Perhaps this obsession with controlling wasn't a bad idea. Grandma Rose knew exactly what she was doing when she left everything to Sarah, and her money has ruined her reputation and relationships. For what Catherine added, the money was never hers in the first place. After hanging up, Michael turned to me and spoke softly. "I'm sorry for all of this, for not standing up to her sooner." I took his hand, and he said, "You did stand up to her when it mattered most, and now maybe she'll get the assistance she needs at last." Over the course of the following few months, we learned from family members that Patricia had begun seeing a therapist. The possible criminal charges were withdrawn after she consented to donate a sizable sum to a nearby elder care facility. As for the inheritance, I fulfilled Rose's wishes precisely as she had requested, with half of the funds going into a trust for education for both her future and her future. 1 year after our final court battle, I received an unexpected letter from Patricia, who wrote it on the advice of her therapist as part of her recovery process. "Dear Sarah." The other half was used to expand the small community garden, which Rose had loved turning into a thriving urban farm that supplied fresh produce to local food banks. "I owe you an apology because my actions were motivated by pride, greed, and a misplaced sense of entitlement. I told myself that you were the outsider who threatened our family's legacy, but in actuality, you were the one who was genuinely continuing Rose's legacy of generosity and kindness." The lengthy letter, which was signed simply with regret, Patricia expressed her regret for her actions and asked for a chance to make amends. Michael carefully read the letter and asked, "Do you think she means it?" I honestly replied, "I don't know, but I'm willing to find out." The next Sunday, exactly 3 years after Rose's death, we invited Patricia to join us at the community garden. As she strolled through the flourishing beds of flowers and vegetables, I noticed a change in her expression. "Rose would have loved this," she said softly, touching a. Patria nodded, tears in her eyes, and I realized that now. I only wish I hadn't lost so much to learn that lesson. She always said that gardens were for growing people, not just plants, which is why she left everything to me. I said gently that this wasn't because she loved me more, but rather because she trusted me to grow something meaningful from what she left behind. Patricia's attempts to take control of the inheritance had almost destroyed our family, but in the end, Rose's wisdom had won out. The money had done exactly what she intended, and it had revealed truth. As we strolled through the garden together, I wondered what Rose would make of all this. She had always said that money was like water. Depending on how you used it, it could either nourish growth or erode foundations. In the pavilion, built in Rose's honor, families gather for community events, and yes, Patricia occasionally volunteers to help tend to the gardens her mother-in-law loved so much. Characters tested relationships and ultimately helped heal old wounds. Today, the community garden SS is a testament to Rose's legacy, as local schoolchildren come for lessons about growing food and caring for the environment. I continue to teach kindergarten, passing on Rose's love of learning to the next generation. The inheritance changed many aspects of our lives, but it didn't change who I am or what I believe in at times. She is now humbled by her fall from grace, but maybe that's for the best because the perfectly poised society matriarch has been replaced by someone more sincere and willing to get her hands dirty in real soil rather than family politics. I imagine Rosa grinning with satisfaction that her legacy has grown into something even more beautiful than she had imagined when I'm working in the garden, and I smile too, knowing that the true inheritance wasn't money at all, but rather the courage to stand up for what's right, the wisdom to use resources for good, and the realization that true family isn't about blood or. Catriel learned that lesson the hard way, but perhaps in the end, it's about love and trust that are freely offered, not money. Precisely what Rose had always meant.